Hey, good morning. It's time for our study in the Gospel of Mark. Glad that you're joining with us. I'm Pastor Doug at the Christian Church in Los Alamos, and we're looking at Mark, second chapter. I don't even know where I'm at. The second chapter, looking at 14 in the call of Matthew down through verse 23. And so I am here, and I'm glad that you are too. Hope that you're ready to study the Word. So go ahead and get your Bibles out, turn to Mark, and let's look at it together. I'm going to be reading it first, and then we'll go back and study it. This is from the New American Standard Version. If you have a New English Standard Version, ESV, NIV, any of those kinds of things, it's going to follow pretty close to the same lines. We'll try to talk about some of the differences that do show up, just help us understand the word a little better. So, beginning in verse 14. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And it happened that he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. And the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors. They said to his disciples, "Why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners?" And hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not for those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came to him and said, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the patch pulls away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear results. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." That'll probably be enough to get us through for a morning study. I hope that you are doing well. So we've been following Jesus as he's been making his way through the Galilee, and he is already called a few of his disciples, but the compliment isn't done yet. And we see as he is passing by wherever Levi was, he sees him. And so we get his introduction to Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Levi is sort of the Hebrew of his name. You might even call it Louis in the Greek. It's Leuin, Lewin. And so might just call him Louis for short. We'll stick with Levi. It is a priestly tribe, and whether he's a part of that tribe or not, we don't know for certain, but can't imagine why he would have that name otherwise. We know who his father is, and we know his occupation. And so even though he's Levi in name, he is far from following the standard practices and expectations of God's people according to the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders of the day. He was an outcast. His offerings wouldn't be allowed in the temple. He'd be seen as a traitor to the nation because he'd be collecting taxes not for the temple, but for Rome. So he's sitting in his tax booth, telionon. The word for it's interesting. The word for tax in this word is the word telos, which means the end of something, and a tax was the last thing that happened whenever something came to its completion. So if the harvest was completed, you get your tax from the harvest. The work was done, you get your tax from the payment of the work. And so it's just sort of an interesting term that gets translated tax, but that's generally the way it is for us anyways, today even. And as he's working, and so there's no separation here, He talks about faith at work. He comes to him and he says, "Follow me." Uses the term akulutheu, and that's a word that means along the same way as, or going the same way, or come the same way. It is the most common term that's used for follow. When crowds are following him, when the lepers are following him, when people are following others, it just shows up everywhere. And so it's not a unique term, but it is a term that everyone understood. It was a common everyday term. We all know what it means to go along with someone. And Jesus wanted Levi to go along with him. And it says that he got up and he followed. Same word, did exactly what it happened. And it happened that and this is probably now he referencing to Jesus in verse 15, was reclining. Mine says at the table, although that's not in the text. Some say dining or eating, but it is the term for reclining. But that's the position that they were almost always in whenever they did eat. Very often their tables were set up as a part of one of the rooms for their dining room, usually a stone in the middle of it. At least some of the archaeological digs in Capernaum have shown that. And they would simply be sort of in a U shape like this, but it would be laid down here. So you'd have people along the outside. You could come in and serve from the inside. It wasn't a long table like we have today, but it was conserved sort of the shape of the room. It would be down on the ground, raised up from it, and had cushions and things around the outside, and you would recline to it. It was sort of their living, eating room. They would come in, they would discuss around the table, they would talk around the table, and they would eat at the table. And so those words were often very interchangeable for them, whether they were really eating or not. They'd come into that room, and that's the kind of thing that often happened there. And so he, in his house, I said it was Jesus. So now we get to that part where it says his house. We say maybe that he is really referring to Levi. And so it happened that Levi, was reclining in his house, and many tax collectors, more of the guys that he worked with, and so he was someone that he could get to come with him. And who else is going to be at a tax collector's house than other people? The righteous wouldn't be there because they would see that as a taint, a way that they would become unclean, and they didn't want to be associated with someone like that. The other persons that felt welcomed in Levi's house were sinners. We aren't told why they were sinners. It is the common term hamartia, which is is the opposite of sharing, not sharing. And it's the sense of not sharing in the prize and anything that will hold you back from doing so. Sometimes it's described as missing the mark, those things that keep you from winning a prize or sharing in the prize. And it says that they were dining, and this is a together reclining, same word that we had earlier, just the idea of doing it together. And they were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. So here's Levi, his companions, sinners, with Jesus and the disciples. And it says that there were a lot of them. And it says also they were following him. It's sort of an interesting part at the end of verse 15 there, that we have Jesus. We know he's calling his disciples and they're following. We know now that Levi is following in a very special way, but all of these other tax collectors and these sinners, it says they are also following him in reference to Jesus. We don't know at what level they're following him, the commitment they're following him. We just know that they are. And sometimes that's where things begin, when people start following. They're young, they're new to the faith. They may not know right from wrong or good from bad, but man, they recognize who Jesus is. He's Lord, he's willing to be master, they're willing to learn from him and start, living like he wants them to live. I was once told, whenever there was a discussion about small groups and who you could put in charge of small groups, and the churches were having this discussion, can they only be elder led? Can they only be maybe leader or deacon led? There's afraid of who they put in charge. And the leader of the workshop that I was at said, "Man, we put new Christians in charge of ours," and they're like, Why would you do that?" And they said, "Well, because they're the ones who have lost friends, and we want them to be bringing in their friends to Jesus and meeting Him and learning from Him." And so, if we had someone else, they don't know lost people. They don't have a house full of tax collectors and sinners. Their house is full of people who've been in the church forever. And so it was sort of an interesting concept. Maybe had to stop and think a little bit about it. One of the other people at the meeting said, "Well, what about problems? If you put someone like that, they may not interpret it right. They may get things wrong." And his response was, "Yeah, we probably are causing more. They probably may have more problems and more misunderstandings than." And he used the name of a denomination. I'm not going to go there. Don't want to go down that path. But it was his way of saying, yeah, they're going to make mistakes. They're young. They don't know. But if they're studying the scriptures and they're looking at Jesus, that's going to be the central stone for them. That's going to be their touch pace. That's going to be where they look to things too. And they are not going to stray too far so long as they keep to His word in it. Again, we have to say, well, here are a bunch of these new people, don't know much, but they are with Jesus and they are learning from Him. And so the scribes, who were kind of like the religious scholars of the day, they're the ones who transmitted the word. They were the ones who understood it, almost like a religious attorney, knew the ins and the outs of it. And then you had the Pharisees, who were the leaders of the congregations, the preachers and teachers of their local synagogues, the ones who were leading the people by the word, and they were always in agreement with one another. They tended to be at least portrayed as being legalistic in general, and following the rules, but not really encountering God. They'd gotten to the point in their relationship with Him that it was about the word and keeping it, not about following. So they come to Him and they want to know, why is Jesus, and they must be talking to His disciples, why is He eating with sinners and tax collectors? And they said to His disciples, so they are, why is He eating and drinking? Mine says drinking, but the and drinking isn't in the original text. With tax collectors and sinners. Why is He doing this? Well, the question wasn't because they really wanted to know why. The question was accusatory. The question was basically trying to point out that what Jesus is doing isn't right. It's not, almost said kosher, but I don't want to go on that path either. You can get in trouble with that. But it isn't what they expected, isn't what they wanted, and they wanted to know why. This was wrong. In hearing, and we don't know how Jesus heard. Maybe they were speaking loud enough because they wanted to be overheard. You know how people sometimes do that. And Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a physician." And this term for healthy here is a term for strength and vitality and vigor. It's not those who are already in we might say a positive, good, strong relationship with God, who need someone to get them to that point where they are strong and healthy and can follow God. It's those who are weak. And it is not just a term for weakness here. It's a term for sickness in the New American Standard. It's the word kakos. Sometimes it's translated evil, bad. It's translated miserable, sick, sore, diseased. It gets translated into a lot of different places in English. And he says, in referencing to himself, "I did not come to call." Now, this is that term we get to call. He calls Levi, but there's this general calling as well. "I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." We have in other places where Jesus explains His mission as, "I came to seek and to save the lost." But He didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. And it's worth that hamartia word of saying, well, who are sinners? And we would answer because of our understanding of the fullness of scriptures that hadn't been written when Mark was writing his gospel, especially from Romans, like the 3rd chapter. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Uh, all of us have no excuse. We are all sinners. We are all in a broken relationship with God from our own thinking and doing and acting. And He didn't come to call the people who were in a good relationship with God. He was calling those who were in a broken relationship with God. And we might talk about how do you go from sinner to saint? How do you go from the sinner to the righteous? Well, we know that that comes only through Christ and His grace and His forgiveness that transforms a sinner who accepts Him and repents, who's united with Christ in His resurrection, and who's filled with His Spirit. And so we know that there is that process. He doesn't go into it. They're not ready for that now. He's just getting started with these disciples. But they do say, and starting in verse 18, John, referring to John the Baptist, whom we've already looked at in this study, John's disciples, the ones who are people who are following John, and the disciples, the people who are following the Pharisees, were fasting. Now, the term for fasting here just means they weren't eating, and they did that twice a week. They had days that they set apart to fast, to show control over their appetites, to show their willing and strength to be able to follow God. It's a very austere practice, certainly something that Jesus advocated and even expected. But there's a right time for everything, and this wasn't the right time for these new young disciples. And so they came to him. Not only was he with this bunch of sinners who were following him and these brand new disciples like Levi, who, man, he was just as clueless as everyone else. He says, well, why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? If you remember John, he never ate nor drank. He had an interesting habit when he did eat anyways. And they were already in this different mode in their religious fervor and activity. And so we get an answer from Jesus for these new believers. He says, while the bridegroom is with them. And that's just the term for the groom, we would call him. We wouldn't say bridegroom. The attendants and this term here for attendants of the bridegroom is just one word in Greek. It could even be translated wedding guests. And there's several translations who use that. I think the English Standard Version is one that does. Probably a better translation in this case. So whenever the bridegroom's there, the wedding guests can't fast. Can you imagine going to a wedding and there's a big dinner after it? And everyone's expected to celebrate and enjoy and be having a good time. But you decide that, no, this is a time for me to fast. And I need to break from that. And Jesus said, there's a time for fasting. There's a time for feasting. And in this case, he's saying, man, at a wedding, evidently it was something that these Pharisees would have recognized as a time that you would enjoy the fellowship and the food that goes with the celebration of a marriage. And he said they just can't do that, can they? Wouldn't be appropriate, wouldn't be right. It's not a time to make a grandstand to show your religiosity, but it's a time to celebrate that people are making a good choice in their lives. And so they're not going to do that as long as the groom's with them, but the time for them to fast whenever the groom is taken away. So there is a time when it will happen. To explain this even further, Jesus uses another parable. We get sort of several layers of those right here. He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk or material that hasn't been used right, a cloth, on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch would pull away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear would result. So he's saying that, hey, we've got these young guys don't know much about the ways that they're called, and Jesus is going to be teaching them as they follow him and they learn from him and they mimic his behavior. They're going to be growing. They're going to end up spending 3 years with Jesus, in which they're going to be learning about this. And you can't expect someone to be in year 3 when they're only in day 1. And sometimes as the church, we can be like those Pharisees and we can be like those scribes, and we can expect someone who's brand new to the faith to start acting and thinking like they've been in the church for 20 years. And that's just not reasonable. And if anything, if we take some very strict things and we force them on someone who's not ready to take those steps in their life, we could ruin them altogether. And that's what Jesus is telling these guys. Hey, they're just now learning. They're getting the very beginnings of it. And if I take that old material, that material that's not able to stretch, not able to have some give to it, if I put something on them that's strict and rigid, and I put it there, well, it's going to stay strict and rigid, and they're going to move from where they are. They're going to grow and expand, but that rigidness is not going to be able to go with them, and so it's going to tear apart. I mean, the image is easy to follow. The application is one that's sometimes difficult to embrace. We want to see new Christians grow. We want to see people who are new and following Jesus blossom. We want them to understand the spiritual disciplines that we find that draw us closer to God, that help us to stay healthy and whole in his kingdom, to live for him, to be able to show love and grace and mercy, to be able to recognize how we fight the temptations of the devil, how we understand and study his word, how we seek him to speak to us in our lives. There are lots of things that we want to do, lots of practices that can help someone, but we don't just pour everything on them to start with. We give them a little bit because we don't want to lose them. We don't want to discourage them. We don't want to set them up for failure. We want them to grow. And the idea of if you have a new wineskin, man, it's all intact and it's ready to grow, and it would all go at the same time. And you put the new wine in it. Now, wine at one stage would ferment in the vats, and then they would take it and they would put it into jars. They put it into the wine skins, and then because there's another growing stage there. And then after it's reached that next stage where it's not going to expand anymore, or at least not very much, then you could put it into an old wineskin, or you could put it into another vessel that it's not going to break apart. And so it is sort of interesting. There are a lot of people who take that new wine in a new wineskin, and they'll relate it to a new Christian being filled with the Holy Spirit, and how their life just begins to grow and expand together, rather than having this tension of pushing and pulling and fighting and being legalistic, and ended up tearing and disappointing and making things worse than they were before. So I hope as we've gone through the study, it's made you reflect and consider how you're growing in Christ, the wine that God has poured into your life, and how it's expanding, and also now that there is a time for fasting. The bridegroom has been taken away in that sense. We're not in that immediate celebration with him. And there's a time for us to be able to spiritually discipline ourselves in a way in which it is good for us to be reminded that we only have one Lord and Savior, and it's his will that we want, not our flesh's will, not our appetite, not anything else. We want to follow Jesus and him alone. And so we should encourage those new to the faith to begin walking and following, just as we need to encourage those who are old in the faith to be walking and following, because all of us are sinners saved by his grace, and Jesus has called us, and we respond to the call. There's also some people who take this passage and they talk about a level of evangelism. that from the get-go, here is Levi, who is just beginning to follow Jesus, doesn't really know anything about what that means. It's only been a day. And the first thing he wants to do is for everyone he knows who needs their life changed in the same way he needed his life changed by following Jesus to come and see Jesus and let that change happen. And at least for Levi, all of his friends, all the way there, they did. And just imagine if all those that you're connected with would do the same. That would be worth celebrating. Hope you've had a good time in our study. Hope God has been speaking to you this morning. And I'll get back to you together when we take up the next section in the Gospel of Mark. God bless.